In Fire Emblem Three Houses, the plot of the game has a particular focus on these magical crests. The magical symbols which appear on the bodies of the wielders are said to give divine and magical powers to the crest bearers. Within the context of the lore, if you have a major crest, a minor crest, or no crest at all, it can directly determine your value in society. The noble line of your family could be threatened if your children fail to manifest these abilities. Just like the power of the Holy Blood in Fire Emblem 4, these crests in Three Houses have the ability to shape the world. The structure of religion, politics, nobility, and war all revolve around those who bear these crests. But how powerful are they actually? So on this channel, one of the things I really like to do is analyze the integration between gameplay mechanics and story. There are more than 20 crests that we know about and have specific information on exactly which abilities they give the users. I want to look at the power given by each of these crests and determine something. Does this give me an advantage against my enemy in combat? Does it give me the power to change the world? Or does it just do basically almost nothing? Well, there's only one way to find out, so let's get right into it. The first thing I want to draw attention to is that basically every crest on this list only has a chance of activating. This chance can range from as low as 5% to as high as 70%. And with that in mind, the impression that I get is that crests will not always activate when you need them to. And so while they do have the ability to give you an extra boost of power at a key moment, they aren't a guarantee to success. Not in the same way as something like Awakening's Axe Fair, Fate's Quick Draw, things that you can always count on for extra damage. This means that even people who bear a crest need to be careful when choosing their engagements. If you can't win without your crest, then you're still putting your life at risk. For example, let's look at the Crest of Reigan and the Crest of Chevalier, which have the same effect. 50% of the time, they will heal you for 30% of the damage you have dealt. Now, in terms of gameplay mechanics, we know what this means. Over time, you're expected to heal about 15% of the damage you deal. If you're tracking the amount of damage you take and heal over, let's say, 100 combats, this will average out. But on a case-by-case basis, you're actually getting either 0% healing or 30% healing, and you don't get to choose when this happens. Unreliable recovery methods like this can be effective in situations, but it's usually if the wielder has the ability to survive a number of attacks, even if the crest doesn't activate. And they also need the offensive power to make sure that 30% of their damage actually gives them a relevant amount of healing. The inconsistency of the crest means that if you would normally die in 2 attacks, it's pretty likely at some point that you will fail to get your healing twice in a row, and you will eventually die. However, if you're able to survive 10 attacks normally, it becomes pretty likely that the crest will activate at least once in those 10 attacks, and extends your lifespan even further. For this reason, I think the Crest of Reigan and Chevalier are powerful, but limited in their applications. They're typically only useful if you're already very strong. A strong bearer of this crest will become even more powerful, but a weaker person wouldn't really get much use out of this effect. And there is another thing that crest can do, and it is a lot more reliable. In the world of Three Houses, there are special heroes' relics and sacred weapons, which are far more powerful than normal weapons, and they give access to exclusive combat arts. However, you must have the appropriate crest in order to wield the weapon safely and to its maximum potential. Someone without a crest could suffer damage or debilitating effects. They could possibly get corrupted by the weapon and become a mindless beast. Even though the Crest of Reigan and the Crest of Chevalier give the same effect in combat, they have different heroes' relics and sacred weapons which are associated with them. This can be one way to differentiate crests which are otherwise very similar. The Crest of Reigan allows the user to wield Failnaught, the most powerful bow, which deals high damage and has a high critical hit chance. Additionally, it has a naturally longer range than most other bows, comparable with that of a longbow, and it is one of the few weapons that has this property. Needless to say, While this 30% recovery ability that sometimes activates wasn't particularly useful, the ability to wield a powerful bow like Failnaught without any drawbacks is by far the superior benefit of having this crest. Even better is the fact that it's an E rank bow, which indicates even if a character without any archery training could still use the Failnaught to its full power and effects, as long as they have the Crest of Reigan. And technically, anyone could attempt to use the Failnaught even without a crest, but the damage they sustain after firing it might outright kill them, it might severely injure them, and even if they survive, it could corrupt them. The Crest of Reigan completely nullifies this weakness. It allows the user to fire it with no drawbacks, and it gives another benefit. They will also be able to use Fallen Star, a powerful combat art which increases the damage, accuracy, and critical rate of the weapon even further. After using Fallen Star, if the opponent somehow survives, you'll also be immune to the effects of any counterattack that you would have sustained. This synergizes very well with the Crest of Reigan's innate healing mechanic, allowing an injured hero to fire the bow and attempt to finish off an enemy while hoping for a 50% chance to heal themselves. But even if they don't get the healing, they're not at risk of being counterattacked anyway, so you could even attempt this maneuver while on low health and not worry about getting killed in the process. It was difficult to imagine how someone with a 50% chance to get 30% healing could become the ruling power of an entire country, but with the strength of the Failnaught and the power of the Fallen Star, it's a lot easier to picture how the bearer of this crest could become a dominant and unifying military power. However, it also stresses the importance of making sure that the Failnaught does not fall into the wrong hands. You want to ensure that this weapon and the power of the crest remains in your family and in your bloodline, so that others don't gain access to this power. This also explains why the noble families in Fodlan behave the way that they do, with regards to social structure and governing policy. The absolute last thing the nobility wants is for commoners to get their hands on these powerful weapons. It could be used to overthrow the ruling power if the rebels are willing to risk their lives by using a weapon that causes damage to them, and even worse, they could turn into monsters and rampage across the country. Now, there are a bunch of heroes' relics and sacred weapons in this game, and almost every crest that we're going to talk about is associated with at least one of them. In some cases, up to 3 different special items. I made the decision early on when I was writing this script that I'm not going to talk about every single relic and every single sacred weapon in the game. I feel this would artificially inflate the length of the video, and it would take the focus away from the crests, which are the things that I really wanted to talk about. So keep in mind that for every crest we discuss, I am rating them based on the mechanical benefits of their specific crest abilities. They all likely have some additional effect with unique weapons and combat arts. Not all of them are going to be as powerful as the Failnaught, but that was a good example of the type of power you can get, and they're all powerful weapons within the game's setting and the lore. However, if I was going to talk about all of the relics and all of the sacred weapons, I would just do that in a separate video. So for now, I want to just talk about the crests. And next up, I want to move away from the healing power and look at the crests which raise destructive power, specifically with regards to magical attacks. The Crest of Gloucester and the Crest of Macuil have the effect of increasing magical damage by 5 points, a mere 20% of the time. Now, I could be missing something here, but this does not feel like a very powerful effect. The activation chance is low, but the damage increase is so small that it doesn't ever feel like it would be worth the risk of fighting while relying on this power. If you were in a desperate battle and the margins were so thin that an extra 5 points of damage would be enough to secure victory, you would generally not want to risk this on a 1 in 5 chance of winning that battle. In that situation, it would be better to avoid battle entirely, and only rely on this power when absolutely needed. In most cases, it's going to be overkill. It's going to add extra damage in a fight that you've already won. To make matters worse, with the applications of this crest being so narrow and unreliable, you aren't going to have a major impact on the battlefield. Even if you get pushed to your limit and you're forced to gamble on that 20% chance of survival, and even if you get lucky and you succeed, Well, you've only defeated one enemy. There's still an entire army to fight and to deal with. This could be useful from a gameplay perspective. If I was trying to plan out a low turn clear for a map, this is a style of gameplay where characters want to achieve victory conditions in as few turns as possible. Okay, it's fine to rely on a 20% chance to get that extra power you need to kill the boss. You can reset the game 5 times until you hit that activation chance, and then you've accomplished your goal, and you can upload the video to YouTube. But in a realistic scenario, not using game logic, if these crests are actually real within the context of the world that they exist, I don't think I would feel very confident following someone into battle if the only thing they could promise is that 20% of the time they're going to deal a tiny bit of extra magical damage, and I certainly wouldn't be willing to risk my own life on a 20% chance that I might win. But how much is that extra magic damage even worth? Well, because we're playing 3 houses, we actually have a very easy comparison point for that. You see, the difference between Fire and Bolganon is exactly 5 points. The difference between Thunder and Thoron is exactly 5 points. So it seems like 5 points of magical damage is about equal to the difference between an E rank and a C rank spell, putting aside any of the other benefits that you would have gotten from raising your weapon rank and from leveling up. Now, if this was any other Fire Emblem game, we could probably make an estimate of how much combat experience the caster has based on how many engagements it takes to raise their weapon rank from E to C. But in 3 houses, we can do even better than that. So first, in 3 houses, it takes 300 experience to go from a novice spellcaster to being able to wield a C rank Tome of Reason. When you attack in combat, you get 1 to 3 experience, we'll say 2, for the sake of argument, and if you're training properly by using the right weapons and proficiencies, you can get an additional few points. Again, this ranges from 1 to 3, but we'll use the number 2 again because it represents a relatively average value. With that information in mind, a person with average ability who's training properly and using a weapon they are proficient with is going to need to attack 75 times before they can use a C rank spell. Assuming you were using Fire 10 times and Thunder 8 times per battle, while increasing your Reason rank from E to C, you would need to fight in more than 4 battles on average while expending all of your spell uses. That is a pretty rough campaign, and it shows that this person has been through war and experienced real combat. You can also study about 4 or 5 times per week, as long as you always keep your motivation at the highest level. There is a large amount of variance to the experience you gain from doing this, so I'm not going to break it all down to an exact mathematical science. I don't feel like making that model, but I can give a pretty reasonable estimate based on my experiences with the game. Let's say you're getting about 24 experience per week from magical lessons, and an extra 28 from weekday lessons. I know the min-max community out there is going to crucify me for this estimate, but please remember, I'm not aiming to maximize experience gain for this example in a way that you would when you're optimizing for gameplay. This is meant to be an analysis of what an average student could reasonably gain in about a week's worth of time in this world based on the numbers that we have. So with 52 experience per week, it would take you about a month and a half in order to increase your expertise in magic to go from using that basic fire spell to the Bolganon spell. All of this is to say that the mere activation of the Crest of Gloucester gives the caster a level of power that could boost a novice's ability to that of a combat veteran, who has experienced a handful of battles already, or trained in magic for over a month straight. Dedicated, hardcore training. Although this isn't exactly true because it doesn't really account for things like how a character who's been in 5 battles and has been on, in a war, they've already leveled up a few times. They're going to be dealing more damage from the increase to their magic stat. And in fact, this brings me to the bigger problem with the Crest of Gloucester. This floor analysis of how things look at the lowest level for a novice actually makes the crest seem more appealing than it really is. And that's saying a lot, because even what we've seen so far is pretty underwhelming. But unlike the Crest of Reigan, which made a powerful fighter even more powerful by allowing them to sustain combat for longer, the Crest of Gloucester becomes less and less useful the more experienced you are as a mage. If your magic stat is low and you're only dealing 10 damage, an extra 5 damage is a 50% increase. That's pretty nice, but if you're already dealing 30 damage, an extra 5 damage is only a 16% increase. And this relative level of power increase only goes down more and more as you get stronger and stronger. The only thing I will say to its credit is that eventually a top level mage will hit a wall. When your magic stat is capped, when you're already using the strongest tome and skills, when there's no other way to boost your damage stack and you've already hit the ceiling, at that point, the ability to break the cap with an extra 5 damage on top is something that nobody else could do. So in that situation, it might sometimes help in a very specific case where, let's say, 50 damage wasn't enough, but 55 damage could do it, and you're the only person who can do that. My only issue here is the low 20% activation rate, which is something you can never improve. If you look at the archive of videos on my channel, you're going to notice that I play Fire Emblem Awakening more than any other game. And that game is really defined by its percent activation abilities, but in Awakening, as you get stronger and your skill gets higher, the chance of activating these skills increases. So it's not just that Ignis is more powerful than the Crest of Gloucester, which it is. The problem is that over time, I become significantly more likely to activate Ignis. It might start around a 20% chance to deal 5 damage, similar to the Crest of Gloucester, but it can raise to over a 50% chance to deal 18 damage. The Crest Bearer is always stuck with that unreliable and underwhelming 20% chance to only add 5 damage. Many of the other crests have a similar problem. They give a small 5 damage boost. There are a few others that I'll mention in a second, but the most direct comparison is the Crest of Fraldarius. It has a somewhat better 40% activation chance, but it's stuck with the same plus 5 damage effect. This is a little better than the Crest of Gloucester, but it's still underwhelming when we compare it to things like Astra, Luna, and Ignis. The extra damage is only a little bit higher than the gap between using a steel sword and a silver sword, and honestly, the ability to build a higher and higher damage stack can be useful, especially when you're planning for specific clears under challenging restrictions or low turn counts. But that's not something characters in the world are doing, they're just fighting and trying to survive, and the unreliability of a 40% chance is always going to hurt your performance when you're comparing this against Swordfare, a skill that anyone can get with or without a crest. Also, it's weird to say this, but most of the most basic combat arts in the game are actually both more reliable and more powerful than these supposedly all-powerful crests. When I look at things that way, it does make me wonder how these crests could have been used to shape society, if not for the hero's relics. Analyzing the exact amount of extra damage, comparing this to weapon experience and time and experience on the battlefield, or studying in the classroom is one thing, but we have the numbers. It's possible for a fighter without any kind of crest to gain an extra 5 damage on demand 100% of the time, and when they need to, by using Wrath Strike. So what's the point of these crests? They don't seem to actually add all that much, especially when you're comparing them to other sources of power and damage that already exist in the world. In fact, it's even worse, because with a crest like Fraldarius, the activation chance cannot trigger when you're using a combat art. This means you're choosing between a 40% chance to deal an extra 5 damage with your crest, or a guarantee to deal the same damage or more damage with a combat art that you can guarantee. This makes the combat arts feel more powerful, despite the fact that they're more widely accessible. On the other hand, we have crests like Gautier, Seiros, Sharon, and Daphnel, which have a higher activation chance, but they require you to use a combat art. So again, the use of the combat art is the most important thing here. If you can't use combat arts, you couldn't even activate this crest to begin with, and you're probably getting more damage from the combat art than you're getting from the crest. Even the Crest of Reigan, one of the better ones we talked about earlier, requires you to use a combat art. This means that it can't even be used for semi-reliable or effective enemy phase sweeping in the same way that you can use soul tanking strategies. I guess it does come down to those heroes' relics and sacred weapons that we talked about, because without those, most of these crests feel pretty underwhelming. Do they have the power to shape the world? Really? I just don't see it. A small chance to deal an extra tiny bit of damage, 1 out of 5 times, is not the kind of power that could allow someone to shape the flow of an entire battlefield. Still, there are a few crests that I think do have quite powerful effects, so I want to discuss those here, and I'm going to give some credit to the crests which are a bit more powerful than just replicating the effects of a weak combat art, sometimes with a very low % chance to activate. The Crest of Cethleann has a 50% chance to increase the amount of healing granted by 5 points. This isn't completely insignificant, but it's hard to quantify. When it activates, it might not matter. In a lot of cases, it might not matter. And when it fails to activate on your first attempt to heal somebody, then it's even less likely to matter on the second, because the second heal is probably going to bring them back to full health anyway. Within the context of the game and the story, 5 damage could represent a significant injury to a commoner or a soldier or a knight, and the ability to go around healing people for a little bit of extra, this might help you build a reputation as a talented healer, but this one honestly doesn't feel too compelling to me. I'm not sure exactly where I would rank it, but the use of this crest doesn't feel too much more significant than, someone who already just possesses the ability to magically heal people instantly. Being able to do that slightly better isn't something that most people are going to notice or even be able to tell the difference, especially not when it's so inconsistent. And on the battlefield, this is only going to matter in very specific cases, where the target would have either immediately lived or died in the next few seconds based on exactly 5 or less HP. So it's unlikely that there were very many moments in history where the Crest of Cethleann had a pivotal effect that changed the outcome of a battle. The best thing about it is the 50% activation chance, which gives it more opportunities to actually matter. Speaking of high activation chances, the Crest of Goneril gives a 50% chance to prevent enemy counterattacks when you're using a combat art, and the Crest of Cichol has the same benefit, although it's interesting that the Crest of Cichol is possessed by a significantly higher number of crest bearers, and it has a larger number of sacred weapons associated with it as well. What I like about the Crest of Goneril and the Crest of Cichol is that this effect has a very good activation chance. 50% is pretty good, and because it synergizes with the already impactful combat arts, it makes them even more dominant and more powerful. In this world, it feels like combat arts are the most significant tool, even more significant than crests. So having a crest which synergizes with combat arts and activates half of the time, I think would create a seriously reliable benefit when it comes to securing military victories and leading nations into battle. When you use a combat art, you're aiming to instantly remove that enemy. But even if you miss your attack or the opponent barely survives and attempts to fight back, well, you can completely nullify their offense in half of those cases. Okay, sure, there's always going to be the possibility that the very first opponent you fight is an absolute powerhouse. They survive your deadly combat art, they counterattack you, they land a 5% critical hit, and your crest fails to activate, and you're instantly removed from the battlefield. Well, no one who steps onto the battlefield is guaranteed to survive, but I do feel that the Crest of Goneril and the Crest of Cichol actually give the user a high statistical likelihood of remaining on the battlefield for longer and eliminating a larger number of foes before they are forced to retreat, compared to someone without that crest. The Crest of Aubin has a similar effect. This one activates when you're using a weapon, but not when you're using a combat art. The big difference between the Crest of Aubin and the Crest of Goneril is that in addition to working on all weapon attacks and not working with combat arts, it has a significantly lower activation chance. At only 20%, this becomes a lot less of a sure thing, and because a regular attack is less likely to actually defeat the opponent before they have the chance to counter, this makes the Crest of Aubin feel significantly less powerful. In my opinion, in a real battlefield type scenario, the bearer of the Crest of Aubin would be at far more risk in combat, since they'd need to avoid using combat arts in order to get the benefit of their crest. but their chance of taking retaliatory damage would be much higher, on top of leaving opponents alive and giving them more chances to attack because they're not using a combat art. Oh, and I guess it's worth mentioning that Anna has a similar crest called the Crest of Ernest, and it's the only one that doesn't have an associated hero's relic or sacred weapon. I never played the DLC in this game, so maybe someone can explain to me why that is. If I had to guess, maybe Anna is from another world, which doesn't really explain why she has a crest, but might explain why she doesn't have any kind of hero's relic. I don't know, I'm not sure. There are a lot of crests with pretty individual effects, but before I talk about those, I want to talk about another category of crests, which all share a type of effect, and it has to do with conserving spell usage, or to look at it another way, extending the energy of the spellcaster before they become fatigued, before they become unable to cast more spells. The Crest of Dominic and Noah have a 20% chance to conserve the use of offensive magic when you try to cast an offensive spell. This effect is interesting because it can have a strong effect both on spells with a high number or a low number of magical charges by default. For example, if you cast 30 times, you're getting a lot more additional charges, where on the other hand, if you could normally only cast a spell once, it's probably very powerful, and being able to cast it twice would actually be a pretty big deal. Timotheos and Lamine are both healing crests. They have a similar 20% chance effect, but in this case, it's just when casting recovery spells. And actually, unlike the crest of Cethleann that we discussed earlier, I do feel like this effect would be significant. If you imagine a lone monk going to a war-torn area, healing injured civilians, refugees, and soldiers, the amount of healing they can do in a single day is going to be limited. But if they're able to heal 20% more times, I think that would actually matter. That would draw attention to them, as this person is going to make a name for themselves, using their healing an unusually large number of times on this battlefield. The crests of Dominic and Noah, I think, follow similar logic, and it's why I tend to rate them higher than crests which give a small power increase, even though they have a similar activation rate. The thing with the Crest of Dominic, for example, is that it actually does scale and becomes more powerful as you become more powerful. 5 damage is going to matter less when you're dealing a lot of damage already, but if you can shoot 10 fireballs per day, now you can shoot 12. And if you can shoot 30 fireballs per day, well, now you can shoot 36. And at this point, you're also probably a more powerful mage, where each of those 36 spellcasts are dealing significantly more damage and having a bigger impact on the battlefield. Even if you don't end up using every single spell charge, if you're in a position where you don't have to worry about conserving your mana, this is going to allow you to cast more spells freely without holding back, and so you're going to have a more immediate impact in battles. Additionally, if you are likely to cast 20 spells in a day, this effect has more time to regress to the mean, and you actually get those 20% extra casts over the course of a full combat. The situation where a sword-wielding fighter needs to activate their 40% crest ability right now in order to survive, otherwise they're going to get killed, and they're removed from the fight immediately, that gives them fewer chances to eventually hit this 40% average. There's more opportunity to high roll for sure, but there's less time to achieve statistical consistency. So we think the Crest of Fraldarius is going to lead to big moments when it does activate, and the Crest of Noah is going to lead to more consistency over time. The problem is that an extra 5 damage is actually rarely going to lead to those big battle-defining moments, unless you're operating in the third person, using extra-dimensional logic, and you've planned out a one-turn clear before the battle even begins, and you can reset the game over and over again until you get the desired result. This is something the characters in the world don't have access to, and for that reason, I really value consistency a lot more. Now, with regards to crests that actually do have big effects, that actually will define a battle, crests that lead to these big moments, even though the activation rate is low, we do have a few good candidates. The Crest of Blaidydd will double the power of a combat art, while also burning through the weapon charges you're using at an accelerated rate. We already touched on this earlier, but synergizing with combat arts usually leads to better crest abilities, because combat arts are already good, and you already want to be using them. Additionally, doubling the might of a combat art is usually going to be more impactful than the small bonus you get from the other offensive crests. There's only a few arts that have less than 5 might, and in the many cases where they give 7 or 10 might, this means you're getting an extra 7 or 10 attack. Additionally, it has this weird synergy which may or may not be a bug, I'm not sure, but if you use a multi-hit combat art, the effects of the Crest of Blaidydd can activate on the second or third attack without burning additional weapon charges, but still adding extra damage. Also, I didn't personally test this next thing myself, but I did a bit of research, and it does seem to be the case that if the crest activates while using a combat art with effective damage against a specific type of enemy, the double multiplier from the Crest of Blaidydd will stack on top of the effective damage multiplier, giving this art even further synergy with not just multi-hit arts, but also with effective damaging arts. Granted, in a gameplay sense, if you're using a combat art to remove an enemy, you're typically already aiming to remove them with 100% consistency, and you don't want to worry about crest activation rates. However, within the context of this world, where characters are unable to see their own stats, they can't see their own character sheets, it's a reasonable consideration that this crest, which can massively boost damage, unlike the ones previously discussed, scaling to very destructive numbers is going to be a lot more scary. It's just a shame that the activation rate is so low, and in fact, because Dimitri's activation rate is only 10%, it's even more underwhelming in actual gameplay. Still, we know that combat arts are strong, so having a crest which synergizes with them is a positive quality in my eyes, especially with how the Crest of Blaidydd works quite well with different types of combat arts specifically, and it does increase the damage by so much that even if the activation chance is rare, I can imagine moments in history where a 40 damage attack suddenly became like a 70 or 80 damage attack and allowed a hero to defeat an extremely powerful enemy at a key moment. Now, next up, I have an effect which I actually can't tell if it's stronger or weaker because it depends on how you look at it, but it is relative in terms of design space to the Crest of Blaidydd. The Crest of Indech is the same maximum 20% activation rate, with most of the playable characters having that weaker 10% chance, just like Dimitri with his crest. So what does this Crest of Indech actually do? When you're attacking with a regular weapon and not using a combat art, it has a 20% chance to allow you to attack twice consecutively, similar to how brave weapons work. It can't be used with a brave weapon, which is sad, because that reduces the number of times you could fish for this doubling effect to get even more attacks. However, even with a regular weapon, this effect is not bad. It's good for the same reason that brave weapons are good. The activation rate is a lot lower than I would have liked. I'm usually satisfied with skills or abilities that have activation rates from 50% to 90%, not something that remains at a stagnant 10 or 20% for the entire game and never goes up. However, the double attacking effect could be even more powerful than the double might effect from the Crest of Blaidydd, depending on the situation. By attacking twice, you aren't just doubling the might of your combat art, you're also doubling the power of the weapon that you're using. You're also doubling your strength. You're also doubling all of the other flat modifiers that you have available. If you get plus 10 damage from your damage stack, you get that twice now, so you actually get 20 damage. Do you have 26 strength? Well, if you're attacking twice, that's 52 damage. When this effect activates, it's almost guaranteed to be devastating. The only situation where it doesn't work is when you're fighting an enemy so powerful that you barely deal any damage to them. Barely dealing any damage twice isn't that significant, I will admit, but there aren't very many other crests on this list that would have helped you in that situation anyway. In all other cases, the Crest of Indech is going to be pretty universally powerful. In a standard combat, it's pretty typical for opponents to defeat each other in 2 attacks. Being able to attack twice and defeat the opponent instantly is like having the effect of the crests that cancel the opponent's counterattack, but you also do that by just removing them completely before they have time to do anything. With that in mind, when I think about it that way, the Crest of Indech has the same activation rate as the Crest of Aubin, but it also deletes the opponent instead of only preventing them from attacking you. So it does feel like one of the more powerful effects that we've discussed so far. It's gotta be at least in the top half. The bearer of this crest could become a legendary figure on the battlefield for their deadly prowess, an insanely fast warrior leading your side to victory while double attacking opponents at high speed. Given that people love fast, flashy attacks and fighting styles, I can imagine this kind of scenario, where the Crest of Indech user becomes quite popular in their time. Oh, and then we have the Crest of Flames, which is just truly bizarre. It has a combination of different effects, with extremely high variance and low activation rates. This feels like a power you could never truly rely on, and yet it could have small benefits in a wide variety of situations. Basically, the way that it works is that you have a 20% chance of activating. It seems to work whether you're using a weapon, a combat art, or a spell, which does make it a lot more broadly applicable than most of the other crests, which only activate under one of these specific conditions. And when the Crest of Flames does activate, you get a 30% healing effect, which we've already discussed can be quite useful. So if you only plan around always having this effect, it's actually not so bad. And unlike the Crest of Gautier, which can only be utilized offensively with combat arts, this crest can be used for enemy phase tanking. Now when this does activate, it also has an additional 30% chance to activate a second effect. The second effect is a 50-50 split between either raising your damage or preventing counterattacks, but this translates to a roughly 3% chance to boost your attack power by 5, or a 3% chance to prevent counterattacks. This makes it by far the least reliable crest to get those specific effects. The power you get from the Crest of Flames would honestly be unexpected and unreliable in most cases, so I don't see a way that the bearer could plan around having most of these or using most of these effectively. But this doesn't change the fact that it would still have an impact on the battlefield around 20% of the time. And most importantly, if you purely look at this crest as a reliable replacement or added layer of protection on top of soul tanking, it doesn't look too terrible. The fact that the activation rate never increases above 20% is pretty bad, but it does give free healing over the course of a lengthy enough battle, and the Crest of Flames' ability to synergize with every different type of player and enemy phase combat also makes it very nice. It means you're never limited or never locked out of being able to access the main healing power. I imagine the Crest of Flames bearer would be extremely difficult to kill and get rid of, and very chaotic. You never know what they're going to do compared to the other crest bearers, even if they don't have the offensive potential of being able to double the might of an effective weapon art, or to strike twice in quick succession. All in all, my opinion of the crests is that they have a pretty wide range of power. Some of them make you slightly better at what you can already do. Others almost never change the outcome of a battle. They have low activation rates with effects that usually don't matter. And others would legitimately give you the power to tear through opposing armies, or at least become very difficult to kill as you are constantly healing yourself. These effects on their own don't feel that significant to me in at least half of the cases. There are some really good ones, but typically I found the combat arts to be more widely accessible, controllable, reliable, and still have a bigger impact on the battlefield. Training, having stronger weapons or stronger skills, could reasonably be used by anyone to surpass the power given to a crest bearer, although having a crest on top of all of those things could make you even better in some cases. However, we really cannot discount the ability of these heroes' relics and sacred weapons. In my opinion, the mere ability to wield these powerful weapons without the risk of damaging or corrupting yourself is the one massive advantage that puts crest bearers on a level of their own above all other soldiers and leaders. If you can draw unique and powerful combat arts from these weapons, you can actually shape the world with this power, and it makes the importance of protecting and consolidating this power even more important. Now, I'm certainly not an expert when it comes to 3 houses, but I thought it was fun to make this video as something different from my usual. I do tend to focus more on gameplay mechanics than I do on lore, so if there are any mistakes that I made, if there's any information that I missed or overlooked, feel free to let me know in the comments below. I usually get at least a few good ones each video, which bring up interesting facts about the game's lore or setting, things that I missed while doing my research but which people would definitely want to hear about. And if you enjoyed this video, press one of those buttons down there. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day.